When Mara found the half-frozen stranger bleeding into the pristine snow of her property, she had no idea that the ground beneath her humble cabin concealed a secret that had been buried since the frantic days of the first gold rush. She did not know that saving him would unlock a subterranean labyrinth holding a fortune vast enough to topple governments, nor did she realize it would bring the devil himself to her doorstep. If you want to see how a lonely widow stands against an army for the sake of a stranger, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now. The winter of 1883 had descended upon the valley like a heavy, suffocating blanket, sealing the world in a silence so profound it felt like the pause before a scream. Mara lived in the center of this white void, her existence defined by the rhythm of survival and the dull ache of a grief that had not faded with the passing years. Her cabin, a sturdy structure of rough-hewn timber and stone, sat perched on a rise that overlooked the treacherous pass, isolated from the nearest township by 20 miles of treacherous, winding trails that were now impassable. She was a woman carved from the same hard earth she walked upon, her hands calloused from the axe and the rifle, her eyes the color of the storm clouds that perpetually hugged the peaks. Since her husband had passed 3 winters ago, taken by a fever that burned hotter than the hearth, she had learned that loneliness was not an absence of noise, but a presence in itself, a cold companion that sat with her at the dinner table and slept beside her in the empty bed. The days were short, brutally cold, and filled with the unending chores required to keep the frost from claiming her life. She chopped wood until her shoulders burned, she checked the snare lines with the methodical precision of a predator, and she melted snow for water, every action a defiant testament to her refusal to die. It was during one of these routine checks of the perimeter that the white monotony was broken by a jarring splash of crimson. The wind was howling, a banshee scream that tore through the pines, whipping ice crystals against her exposed skin, but Mara's eyes were sharp, honed by years of scanning the horizon for wolves. Down near the creek bed, where the ice had formed thick, jagged sheets over the running water, a dark shape lay slumped against a boulder. It was not a deer, nor was it a bear. It was a horse, its flank heaving in the final throes of death, and tangled in the stirrups, half buried in a drift that was rapidly swallowing him, was a man. Mara did not run. She moved with a calculated urgency, her rifle unslung from her shoulder, the lever action checking around into the chamber instinctively. Caution was the currency of the frontier, and a stranger in these parts usually meant trouble. But as she drew closer, the hostility drained from her posture, replaced by the grim realization of the situation. The man was not moving. He was face down, his coat torn, the snow around him stained a dark, terrifying red that seemed almost black in the failing light of the afternoon. She knelt beside him, the cold seeping instantly through the knees of her wool trousers, and turned him over. He was young, perhaps 30, with a face that hadn't seen a razor in weeks. But it was the wound in his side that commanded her attention, a jagged, ugly hole that had torn through his heavy shearling coat. It was a gunshot wound, old enough to be infected, but fresh enough to still be bleeding. Mara knew she could not leave him there. The temperature was dropping with the setting sun, plummeting toward a degree that would freeze the blood in his veins within the hour. But moving him was a task that would test every ounce of her strength. She didn't know his name, didn't know if he was a saint or a sinner, but out here, life was sacred simply because it was so rare. She unhitched him from the dead horse, whispering a soft apology to the beast before she focused on the man. He groaned, a sound of pure agony that was snatched away by the wind as she grabbed the collar of his coat. It was a brutal, agonizing trudge back to the cabin. The snow clung to her boots, dragging her down, and the dead weight of the stranger felt like an anchor. Every 10 paces she had to stop, gasping for air that felt like swallowed glass, her muscles screaming in protest. The wind battered them, trying to push them back, trying to claim them both for the mountain, but Mara possessed a grit that was harder than the granite beneath the snow. She dragged him not out of kindness, but out of a stubborn refusal to let the winter win. By the time she kicked the cabin door open and hauled him onto the rough floorboards near the hearth, her lungs were burning and her hands were trembling so violently she could barely latch the door against the storm. Once the door was barred, the silence of the cabin rushed back in, but the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. The sanctuary was breached. Mara stripped the stranger of his frozen, blood-soaked coat, hissing through her teeth at the sight of the damage. The bullet had entered low on the left side, likely missing the vitals but tearing through muscle and grazing the rib. It was a messy wound, cauterized poorly and reopened by exertion. She worked with the efficiency of a field medic, a skill set she had acquired not from schools, but from the necessity of frontier life where the nearest doctor was a 3-day ride away. She stoked the fire until the flames roared, casting dancing shadows against the log walls, and set a pot of water to boil. From her pantry she retrieved a jar of willow bark and a distinct amber bottle of raw alcohol. The stranger was unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged, his skin pale and clammy to the touch. She cleaned the wound, her hands steady despite the exhaustion clawing at her mind. As she stitched the torn flesh with a needle sterilized in the fire's heart, she looked at his face. He didn't look like the rough drifters who occasionally passed through. His hands, though dirt-stained, were not calloused by the plow or the pickaxe. There was a softness to his features, a vulnerability that seemed out of place in this harsh, unforgiving territory. Who was he? And who had shot him and left him for the wolves? The storm outside intensified as night fell, the wind slamming against the cabin walls like a physical blow. The timbers groaned under the assault, a familiar symphony that usually lulled Mara to sleep, but now set her nerves on edge. The stranger, she decided to call him that until he could provide a name, lay on the rug before the fire, covered in her spare quilts. Mara sat in her rocking chair, the rifle across her lap, watching him. She didn't sleep. The adrenaline of the rescue had faded, leaving behind a hyper-alert tension. Every pop of the firewood sounded like a gunshot. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps on the porch. Sometime past midnight, the stranger stirred. His eyes fluttered open, glassy with fever and pain, darting around the room in a panic before landing on her. He tried to sit up, but the pain slammed him back down, a gasp escaping his cracked lips. "Easy," Mara said, her voice rough from disuse. "You've lost blood. You move, you tear the stitches." He looked at her, really looked at her, with eyes that held a terrified intelligence. "The map," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Did they take it?" Mara frowned, leaning forward. "Nobody's here but me. I found you in the snow. You were alone." The relief that washed over his face was followed instantly by a new wave of fear. You have to hide it," he mumbled, his hand fumbling weakly at the inside pocket of his ruined vest which lay on the table. "If they find it, they'll kill us both." Mara rose and picked up the vest. Inside the hidden pocket, sewn into the lining, was not a paper map, but a heavy, folded piece of leather, ancient and cracked. She unfolded it carefully. It wasn't a map of the surface. It was a schematic, drawn in ink that had faded to sepia, depicting a complex network of tunnels and shafts. But what caught her eye wasn't the drawing, but the seal stamped in the corner, an insignia she recognized from the stories the old prospectors used to tell in hushed tones at the trading post. It was the mark of the shadowy consortium that had vanished after the Civil War, rumored to have hoarded the wealth of a dying nation. "What is this?" she asked, looking back at him. "It's the key," he whispered, fighting to stay conscious. "To the tunnel. Underneath. Right here." His eyes rolled back, and he slumped into the fever sleep once more, leaving Mara standing in the dim light, the leather map heavy in her hand, realizing that the ground beneath her feet was not just rock and soil, but a ceiling to something else entirely. The revelation gnawed at Mara through the long, dark hours of the early morning. The concept that her home, this sanctuary of grief and survival, sat atop something man-made and secret was disorienting. She knew the history of the mountains. She knew about the abandoned mines that dotted the landscape like open sores, remnants of men who had dug for silver and found only despair. But the schematic in her hand was different. It didn't show a mine. It showed a vault. The lines were precise, architectural, indicating reinforced supports, ventilation shafts, and a central chamber of immense proportions. And according to the orienting landmarks sketched on the leather, the twin peaks to the east, the curve of the river, the entrance wasn't miles away in the hills. It was directly below the foundation of her cabin. Specifically, the diagram pointed to the root cellar. Mara looked toward the trap door in the corner of the room, currently covered by a heavy woven rug and a stack of crates. She had used that cellar for 3 years to store potatoes, turnips, and salted venison. It was a damp, earthen hole, no deeper than 6 feet, with walls of packed dirt and stone. She had never seen a door, a passage, or anything that suggested it was anything other than a hole in the ground. Curiosity, a dangerous thing in the wild, began to override her caution. With the stranger, Julian, as the name sewn into his coat collar read, still unconscious and stable, Mara lit a kerosene lantern. The golden light pushed back the shadows as she moved the crates and pulled back the rug. The trap door was heavy oak, swollen with the humidity of the earth below. She hauled it open, the hinges screaming in protest, and descended the rickety wooden ladder. The air down here was cooler, smelling of soil and root vegetables. She held the lantern high, the light washing over the familiar shelves of jars and sacks. It was exactly as she had always known it, just a cellar. She felt a foolish pang of disappointment mixed with relief. Perhaps the man was delirious, the map a forgery or a misunderstanding. She turned to leave, her boot scuffing against the bottom shelf, a massive, freestanding unit built of heavy pine planks that held her winter reserves. As she turned, the lantern light caught a draft. It was subtle, just a flicker of the flame, but it was there. Air was moving, and it was coming from behind the shelf. Mara set the lantern on a barrel and placed her hands on the shelving unit. It was incredibly heavy, laden with jars of preserves, but the adrenaline of the mystery gave her strength. She braced her shoulder against the wood and pushed. At first, it didn't budge. She gritted her teeth, digging her boots into the dirt floor, and shoved with everything she had. With a grinding sound of wood against stone, the unit shifted. Inch by inch, she pivoted it away from the wall. Behind it, where there should have been only packed earth and foundation stones, there was wood. Not the rough logs of the cabin, but smooth, treated timber, set horizontally into the earth. And in the center of the timber wall was a seam, a door. It was painted to match the dirt, camouflaged perfectly in the dim light, but now, exposed, it was undeniable. There was no handle, only a small circular indentation. Mara's heart hammered against her ribs. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the leather map. Wrapped inside it was a small, strangely shaped iron key that she hadn't noticed before. Her hands trembling, she fit the iron shape into the indentation. It clicked. A mechanism, heavy and oiled, shifted deep within the wall. With a groan of displaced air, the timber door swung inward, revealing not a crawl space, but a gaping maw of darkness that stretched down into the earth. The smell that wafted up from the opening was ancient. Dust, dry rot, and the metallic tang of stagnant air that hadn't seen the sun in decades. It was a sepulchral scent, the breath of a tomb. Mara grabbed the lantern and held it into the void. A set of stairs, cut from solid rock and reinforced with iron beams, spiraled down into the gloom. This was no prospector's hole. This was industrial engineering, funded by massive wealth and constructed with secrecy as the primary objective. She took a step down, the sound of her boot on the stone echoing far deeper than it should have. The tunnel was wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast, the walls lined with smooth brick in places, raw bedrock in others. As she descended, the temperature stabilized, becoming warmer than the cellar above. She walked for what felt like 10 minutes, the spiral ending in a long, straight corridor that ran perfectly level. Along the walls, she saw remnants of the past, rusted lanterns hanging from hooks, discarded pickaxes, and crates stamped with the same insignia as the map. She reached the end of the corridor, where a pair of massive iron doors stood, barred from the outside, but the bars had been lifted, lying on the ground, covered in decades of dust. Someone had been here before, or perhaps the people who built it had intended to return and never did. Mara pushed one of the doors. It swung open on silent, well-greased hinges, a testament to the quality of the make. She stepped through and raised the lantern. The light didn't hit a wall. It spilled out into a vast cavern, a natural hollow in the mountain that had been expanded and fortified. And there, stacked in rows that faded into the darkness, were crates. Hundreds of them. Not the rough supply crates of the corridor, but reinforced transport boxes. One of them near her had been pried open. Mara approached it, her breath hitching in her throat. Inside, nestled in rotting straw, were bars. They weren't gold, not the bright yellow of new money. They were silver, tarnished and heavy, stamped with the seal of the Spanish crown and overstamped with the mark of the Confederacy. But next to it was another crate. This one opened to reveal stacks of oilskin-wrapped bundles. She carefully slit one open with her knife. Bonds. Bearer bonds from the railroads, from the government, land deeds. The scale of it hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just a treasure. It was a war chest. It was the lost shipment legends spoke of, the wealth intended to fund a second uprising or rebuild a fallen empire, hidden away when the cause was lost. Adjusted for inflation, the metal and paper in this room were worth hundreds of millions. It was enough money to buy the entire territory, to build cities, to command armies, and it had been sitting 50 feet below her boots while she starved, while she froze, while she mourned a husband who died because they couldn't afford a doctor. A bitter laugh escaped her lips, echoing sharply in the vast treasure chamber. The irony was suffocating. She was standing in the middle of a kingdom of wealth, yet she was more in danger now than she had ever been in the storm. "You found it." The voice came from the tunnel entrance behind her. Mara spun around, bringing the rifle up, but lowered it slightly when she saw Julian leaning against the doorframe. He was pale, sweating profusely, holding himself upright by sheer force of will, clutching his side. He had managed to crawl down the ladder and limp through the tunnel, driven by fear. "I told you," he wheezed, staring at the mountain of crates with a mixture of awe and terror. "The tunnel. The Baron knows it's here. He has the other half of the map. He's been hunting me for 3 weeks." Julian stumbled forward, his legs giving out, and Mara caught him before he hit the stone floor. "Who is the Baron?" she asked, supporting his weight. Julian looked at her, his eyes wide. "He's the man who hired the men that shot me. He runs the syndicate. He thinks this belongs to him by blood. And now that he knows I came this way, he's going to burn this entire mountain down to get to it." Mara looked from the shivering, injured man to the rows of silent, accursed silver. The isolation that had been her shield was now a cage. They were trapped in a box of snow and ice, sitting on a bomb that the most dangerous men in the West were coming to detonate. She tightened her grip on Julian. "Let them come," she said, a cold resolve settling over her that was harder than the silver bars. "This is my land, and nobody takes what's mine." The silence that followed Mara's declaration was not the peaceful quiet of the winter wilderness, but the heavy, pressurized silence of a held breath before a plunge. They spent the next few hours in a fever of preparation, a grim dance of survival performed within the wooden walls of the cabin that had once been a home and was now a fortress. Mara moved with the economy of a soldier, her grief tucked away into a dark corner of her mind, replaced by the cold logic of ballistics and angles. She positioned herself at the window facing the pass, the shutters cracked just enough to allow the barrel of her Winchester to protrude, while Julian, pale and sweating, sat on the floor loading ammunition with trembling hands. The pain in his side was a constant throbbing rhythm, but the fear of the man known as the Baron was a sharper spur. He spoke of the antagonist not as a mere criminal, but as a force of industrial nature, a man who saw human lives as entries in a ledger, easily erased to balance the books. The wind outside began to die down as the sun touched the horizon, painting the snow in shades of violet and bruised orange. It was beautiful, a cruel contrast to the violence that was riding up the trail. Mara watched the tree line, her eyes watering from the strain, until she saw it. A disturbance in the stillness, a branch snapping where no wind blew, the steam of breath rising from behind a boulder. They were here. "They won't rush us," Julian whispered, reading the tension in Mara's shoulders. "The Baron, he doesn't like mess. He prefers negotiation, then execution." As if summoned by his words, a voice rang out from the tree line, amplified by the valley's acoustics. It was a smooth, cultured baritone, devoid of the rough edges of the frontier. "Mrs. Galloway," the voice called, knowing her name, which terrified her more than a gunshot would have. "And Mr. Thorne, I apologize for the interruption of your evening. My associates and I have had a very long ride. We only wish to retrieve property that was stolen from our consortium. There is no need for bloodshed tonight." Mara didn't reply. She nestled the rifle stock against her cheek, exhaling slowly, watching the vapor of her breath vanish. She knew that voice. It was the voice of a snake charmer. "I know you're in there," the Baron continued, his tone shifting slightly, acquiring a hard, metallic edge. "And I know about the cellar. You have two choices. You walk out, and I give you $1,000 for your trouble and a fast horse to the coast. Or we burn this charming little shack to the ground with you inside it. You have 2 minutes." Mara looked at Julian. He shook his head, his face ashen. "He leaves no witnesses," Julian murmured. "Never." Mara turned back to the window, sighted the source of the voice, a tall figure in a dark coat standing arrogantly by a pine, and shifted her aim slightly to the man standing next to him. She squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle shattered the negotiation instantly, the bullet kicking up snow inches from the Baron's boot. "My property!" she yelled back, her voice raw and fierce. "My rules! Step on the porch and you die!" The response was immediate and overwhelming. The tree line erupted in muzzle flashes, a hail of lead slamming into the cabin. Wood splintered, glass shattered inward, and the air filled with the deafening roar of gunfire and the smell of sulfur. Mara dropped low, crawling across the floorboards as bullets chewed through the logs above her head. The sanctuary was being violated, turned into a sieve. She reached the overturned table where she had positioned her second rifle and popped up, firing 2 rapid shots through the broken window. A scream from outside confirmed a hit. "Reload!" she barked at Julian, tossing the empty rifle to him and grabbing the loaded shotgun. The cabin was sturdy, built by her husband to withstand blizzards, but it couldn't withstand a siege. She could hear them moving, flanking the structure, their boots crunching on the hard-packed snow. They were closing the net. Julian worked frantically, his fingers slick with blood that had seeped through his bandages, but he didn't stop. "They're circling back," he shouted, pointing to the rear wall. Mara spun around just as the heavy thud of a body hitting the back door shook the room. The latch groaned. She didn't wait. She fired the shotgun through the wood of the door. The buckshot tore a ragged hole through the timber, and a man yelled in agony, falling back into the snow. But even as he fell, a new sound emerged, a crackling, hissing sound that sent a spike of pure dread through Mara's heart. They weren't just shooting anymore. They had thrown torches onto the roof. The smell of burning pine tar was immediate and overpowering. The roof, seasoned by years of dry summers and winter winds, caught fire with terrifying speed. Smoke began to curl down from the rafters, thick and acrid, stinging their eyes and choking the air from their lungs. The heat grew intense, battling the winter chill and winning. "We can't stay here," Julian coughed, dragging himself toward the center of the room. "They'll smoke us out or burn us alive." Mara looked around her home, seeing the blackened walls, the shattered keepsakes, the destruction of the only life she had left. Tears of rage pricked her eyes, but she blinked them away. There was no time for mourning. "The cellar," she commanded, grabbing the lantern in her ammunition belt. "Go, now!" She provided covering fire, shooting blindly out the windows to keep the attackers' heads down, while Julian painfully maneuvered down the ladder. The roar of the fire was deafening now, sounding like a freight train passing directly overhead. Embers began to rain down into the living space. Mara took one last look at her rocking chair, now engulfed in flames, and descended into the earth, slamming the heavy oak trapdoor shut above her. She jammed the bolt home, sealing them in. Above them, the house began to die, the crashing of timber sounding like the bones of a giant breaking. But below, in the silence of the root cellar, they were safe from the fire. For now. "Help me move the shelf," Mara gasped, the smoke still heavy in her lungs. They pushed the heavy shelving unit back in place, hiding the secret door, but Mara knew it was a futile gesture. The Baron had the map. He knew exactly where the entrance was. The only advantage they had was the bottleneck. She unlocked the mechanism with the iron key, and they stumbled into the cool, stale air of the tunnel. "We retreat to the vault," Mara said, her voice echoing in the stone corridor. "There's only one way in. We can hold them there." Julian limped beside her, his face a mask of pain. "And then what?" he asked, his voice filled with despair. "We starve? Or wait for them to blow the door?" Mara didn't answer. She was thinking of the layout she had seen on the map, the ventilation shafts, the structural weakness of the old supports. She didn't have a plan for survival yet. She only had a plan for war. They reached the massive iron doors of the treasure chamber and pushed them almost closed, leaving a crack wide enough for a rifle barrel. Mara positioned herself behind a stack of silver bullion, using the wealth of a fallen empire as sandbags. "Here," she said, handing Julian a pistol. "If they get past me, don't hesitate." They didn't have to wait long. The sound of the trap door above being smashed open echoed down the tunnel, followed by the heavy tread of boots on the stone stairs. The Baron was coming, and he wasn't sending his men first this time. He was coming to claim his prize. Mara watched the slice of darkness through the door crack. A light appeared, growing brighter, a lantern held high. Then shadows stretched long and distorted against the tunnel walls. "Mrs. Galloway," the voice came, echoing strangely in the tube of rock. "I must say, I admire your tenacity. Most people would have run into the snow, but you went to ground, like a badger." The Baron stepped into the light, flanked by two men holding carbines. He looked immaculate, despite the chaos above, his coat brushed, his demeanor calm. He stopped 20 feet from the iron doors. "Open the gates," he commanded, his voice bored. "The game is over. The house is gone. There is no rescue coming. Give me the key and I will make your end quick." Mara rested her cheek against the stock of the Winchester. She looked at the support beams above the Baron's head, ancient timber, rotted by damp and time, holding up tons of mountain rock. She shifted her aim. She wasn't aiming at the Baron. She was aiming at the keystone of the archway directly above him. "You're right," Mara's voice rang out from the darkness of the vault, steady and cold. "The house is gone. I have nothing left to lose, but you have everything to lose." The Baron laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "I have the guns, my dear. I have the men. You have a hole in the ground." He took a step forward, his greed pulling him toward the glimmer of silver he could see through the crack. "This wealth builds nations. It does not belong to a dirt farmer widow." Mara tightened her finger on the trigger. "It belongs to the earth," she whispered, "and so do you." She fired. The shot didn't hit a man. It slammed into the rusted iron bracket holding the main support beam of the tunnel ceiling. The impact was thunderous. The bracket shattered, the beam groaned a protest that sounded like a dying wail, and then the ceiling gave way. It wasn't just a few rocks, it was a cascade. The mountain, tired of being hollowed out, reclaimed its space. The Baron's look of polite condescension vanished, replaced by a millisecond of absolute horror before he was swallowed by a deluge of granite and dust. The shockwave knocked Mara backward, slamming her against the crates of bonds. The lanterns were extinguished. Darkness was absolute. For a long time, there was no sound but the settling of dust and the ringing in Mara's ears. She lay in the pitch black, coughing, her hand searching for Julian. "Julian?" she croaked. "Here," a weak voice replied from the darkness. I'm here." Mara fumbled in her pocket for a match. The flare of the phosphorus was blinding. She lit the lantern, the flame trembling in the thin air. The entrance to the vault was gone. In its place was a wall of jagged rock, completely sealing them in. The Baron and his men were buried on the other side. They were alive, but they were entombed with $300 million of useless paper and metal. The air was already starting to feel heavy. Panic flared in Julian's eyes. "We're trapped," he whispered. "We killed him, but we dug our own grave." Mara stood up, shaking the dust from her coat. She walked to the back of the cavern, holding the light high. She remembered the map. She remembered the faint lines that indicated airflow. She moved toward the far wall, where the rock face was natural, not bricked. There, near the ceiling, was a dark fissure. A vent. She could feel a draft, cold, fresh air. It was small, tight, and high up, but it was a way out. "Not a grave," she said, turning to Julian with a weary, soot-stained smile. "A chimney." It took them 3 hours to climb the rock face and widen the fissure enough to squeeze through. It was a nightmare of claustrophobia, scraping their skin raw against the sharp stone, pushing through darkness that felt heavy enough to crush them. But finally Mara's hand broke through into loose snow. She clawed upward, her lungs burning, until she burst out into the blinding white light of the morning. She pulled herself up, gasping, lying on the surface of the world again. She reached down and grabbed Julian's wrist, hauling him up beside her. They lay there in the snow, exhausted, battered, and alive. They were about half a mile from where the cabin had stood. Mara sat up and looked down the slope. Her home was a smoldering ruin, a black scar on the pristine white landscape. The smoke rose lazily into the clear blue sky. The tunnel entrance was buried under tons of rock. The treasure was sealed away, perhaps forever, beneath the weight of the collapsed mountain. The Baron was gone. The threat was gone. And so was her past. She looked at Julian. He was staring at the sunrise, tears streaming down his face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the only thing he had taken from the vault, a single silver bar. He looked at it, then at Mara, and tossed it into the deep snow. "We made it," he said softly. 5 years later, the valley had healed. The scars of the fire were covered by new growth, saplings rising from the ashes of the old pines. On the rise where the cabin once stood, a new house had been built. It was larger, with a wide porch that faced the sunset, and a barn that held 12 horses. Mara stood on the porch, watching a foal take its first wobbly steps in the corral. She looked different now. The hardness around her eyes had softened, replaced by a peace that had been hard won. She wasn't alone. Julian was down by the fence, mending a rail, his limp barely noticeable. They hadn't kept the millions, but they hadn't needed to. The silver was still down there, a secret they kept between themselves and the mountain, a buried ghost of a violent age. They had survived on grit, built a life on trust, and found a wealth that couldn't be stamped with a government seal. The wind blew through the valley, no longer a banshee scream, but a gentle song of endurance. Mara smiled, turning back to the warmth of the house. She had found a stranger in the snow and thought she was saving him, but in the end he had saved her from the cold that had been in her heart. If you enjoyed this story of survival and redemption and want to hear more tales from the untamed frontier, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. We have new stories every week.